Nuclear Warfare Policy, Cold War to Today, Part 8, Counter Value versus Counter Force Doctrines, Part 2 of 2. The prior article in this two-part series was about strategic nuclear doctrine strategy called counterforce, which was created out of the evolving theory of fighting a limited nuclear war. The concepts of counterforce created during the Cold War were to target the Soviet Union's nuclear weapons and the supporting infrastructure and command and control. The ultimate reason for counterforce was to serve the purpose of saving cities, populations, and economies by either degrading the Soviet Union's ability and capability to attack the U.S. cities with their strategic nuclear weapons or serving as a warning not to. The doctrine of attacking the cities and economy of the Soviet Union was called counter value and was the ultimate deterrent and, if necessary, the goal of a general nuclear war. The assets targeted in counter value strategies were the cities and the economy of the Soviet Union. Without these assets, people, and industry, a country could not be a functioning country. It was the ultimate deterrent of a nuclear war, and all other strategies were based on protecting these assets or deterring them from being attacked. Counter value and counter force are U.S. terms but it is agreed that the Soviet Union followed the same basic logic in its targeting doctrines. A nuclear doctrine could also be based entirely on the idea of counter-value targeting. This is known as minimal deterrence and is something that President Carter thought about before he officially declared a limited nuclear war capability. Notably, China had a minimal deterrence policy until the late 2010s. It was called minimal deterrence because the number of nuclear weapons was relatively small. A country's only goal in a nuclear war is to destroy a country's cities and economy. A study during the Nixon, Ford, and Carter administrations had made determination during civil defense reviews that 2,200 nuclear warheads could create up to 120 million Soviet casualties. To understand the minimum size of 2,200 warheads, consider that at the end of the Cold War, the U.S. and Soviet Union each possessed approximately 25,000 nuclear weapons of all types. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who served in this role in both the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, set a criterion that the minimal deterrence force needed to maintain minimal deterrence was to have enough nuclear weapons to destroy 50% of the Soviet industry and 25% of its population. It was determined that the number of warheads needed to accomplish this was 200 to 400 nuclear warheads with a minimum yield of 1 megaton apiece, which is about 67 times the power of the nuclear weapon dropped on Hiroshima in 1945. The goal of this minimal deterrence criterion was the ability to kill at least 62.5 million Soviet citizens. President Carter in Presidential Directive 59 in 1980 did require that any nuclear doctrine of the U.S. maintain a strategic reserve force that would always be available to maintain the minimal level of deterrence. The United States nuclear submarine fleet, with its SLBM warheads, was considered the primary means to provide this reserve force, as seen by President Carter, or the Minimal Deterrence Division by Secretary McNamara. People thought the SLBM was the best weapon for counter-value or minimal deterrence because it wasn't very accurate at hitting nuclear weapon sites before the introduction of the Trident II D5 missile, which came out in 1990. And U.S. submarines at sea were almost impossible for the Soviets to find, so they couldn't attack them. The strategy with a counter-value or minimal deterrence strategy was that if a nuclear attack was to occur, the country being attacked would automatically go right to the ultimate target and launch its full nuclear arsenal at the opposing cities. There would be no escalation path. It would immediately go right to the top of the ultimate target of the country's population and industry. This would also mean that the preferred weapons to use would be submarine SLBMs or strategic bombers that would allow time to evaluate the attack coming into the country. If a minimal deterrence strategy was adopted only on ICBMs, a launch on warning doctrine would be assumed because the counterforce attack would leave the country hostage. The deterrent, if ICBMs were used, is the publicly known position of launch on warning. The issue with minimal deterrence or counter-value only nuclear doctrine for the United States was the fact that it was so reliant on allies and its alliances, mainly in NATO, Japan, and South Korea. The U.S., early on in its strategic doctrine of massive retaliation, extended its nuclear umbrella to allied countries. As the strategic doctrine evolved, the nuclear umbrella was still extended. The United States' commitment to using its nuclear weapons to defend its allies presented a problem. If the U.S. adopted minimal deterrence only and an attack occurred on an allied nation, would the U.S. decide to launch a counter-value attack against the Soviet Union, knowing that the Soviets would respond in kind to the U.S. and attack U.S. cities? The allies of the U.S., most notably President Charles de Gaulle of France, questioned if the U.S. would be willing to sacrifice its cities and people to protect its allies. The basic question from the French president to President John F. Kennedy is, would the U.S. be willing to trade New York to protect Paris? If the U.S. wanted to prevent nuclear proliferation and protect its allies, it could not adopt a counter-value or minimal deterrence only policy. The U.S. commitments did not completely satisfy the British and the French, who both created their own nuclear arsenals to protect their countries. The U.S. adoption of a minimal deterrence or counter-value only doctrine would not have prevented a nuclear arms race, but it would have prevented the U.S. from being involved in one with the Soviet Union. The doctrine of assured destruction, mutual assured destruction, or nuclear equivalency that was adopted during the Cold War, starting in the 1960s, had an unintended consequence that became adopted in nuclear arms acquisition. Both the U.S. and Soviet Union maintained nuclear arsenals of relatively the same size to prevent one side or the other from getting an advantage in the assured destruction goal. If the U.S. did not get into an arms race with the Soviets, logic would suggest, but not guarantee, that the Soviets would be de-incentivized to build a large nuclear arsenal as well. Although the Soviets could have created a large nuclear arsenal to threaten or blackmail other countries in the West to submit to them, this would have an incentivized nuclear proliferation, creating a more challenging strategic situation for the Soviets. In the end, if any of their Soviet threats against the West materialized, it would still result in the ultimate destruction of their society, despite their potentially superior-sized nuclear arsenal. Another factor that worked against the idea of counter-value attack is the moral implication of it, which is comical to say when discussing nuclear weapons that can destroy lives so easily. The moral implication is that the U.S. was in an ideological battle with the Soviet Union, and the U.S. and the West held the moral high ground when it came to human rights and freedoms. The U.S. would be officially committing to counter-value only or minimal deterrence strategy if it meant attacking civilian populations with the goal of causing mass destruction. This would be the case even if the Soviet Union only attacked military sites. This argument seems irrelevant after World War II, when the cities and civilian populations were intentionally attacked, including with 2 nuclear weapons, as part of a total war doctrine. In an ideological war, these inconvenient facts were ignored or glossed over, or explained that the world must not go back to the tragedy of World War II. This moral high ground of the U.S. would have been lost if civilian populations were the first and only target for a strategic nuclear attack. Also, the U.S. vested interests sometimes opposed minimal deterrence or counter-value. These vested interests would mainly be with the institutional elements within U.S. defense establishment. This doctrine would have elevated the U.S. Navy and its nuclear submarines to the top of the services, as it would be one of the most effective in assuring invulnerability of the U.S. strategic deterrence. The ICBM would be unnecessary, and strategic bombers would be as well, though the mobile nature of the bomber would mean it would be justified somewhat in this doctrine. Either way, the U.S. Air Force would find itself without a significant role in the nuclear strategy, which is hard for it to give away when it was at one point the only service with a nuclear role through, first its bombers and later missiles that were both available prior to the advent of the SLBM in 1961. The defense industry would have also lobbied not to give up the ICBM and strategic bombers, though it would not argue against the SLBM either. The defense industry and the influence in Washington would lobby and use its influence for the creation and maintenance of the U.S. strategic triad. The adoption of only minimal deterrence or counter value would most likely have prevented a nuclear arms race. It would have, however, meant that the only nuclear strategy in place would have been the intentional targeting of civilians on both sides. Both the Soviet Union and the U.S. would have adopted strategies that by necessity would be public, that destroying each other's civilians would be the adopted policy and the ultimate goal. Even in a non-democratic Soviet Union, it would create morale problems, which would have impacted embracing the requested sacrifice of communist doctrine and most definitely would have created protests in the West like that was seen in the 1970s and 1980s. No matter the government, civilians make the country possible. Hence, they were the ultimate nuclear target, and their cooperation was essential to state function. This problem is one that civil defense and anti-ballistic missiles of the time could not fix, and is ultimately what incentivized the nuclear doctrines such as counterforce and countervailing. A metaphor would be a dog chasing its tail.